I want to talk a little bit more about depth of field by showing you some historical and contemporary examples of well-known photographers' work using both shallow and deep depth of field to enhance the concept and the aesthetics of a photograph. Your assignment this week is to make some photos being creative with depth of field. You can choose a single subject and experiment with different ways to expose it, or you can just make a series of photos. You might decide that you want to play all with shallow depth of field or all with deep depth of field. I encourage you to really experiment and just try to make as many of the strongest photos you can that really exemplify the creative use of depth of field. So let's start back here in the 19th century. I believe we looked at this photograph a long time ago. This is Julia Margaret Cameron, and she was a very early fine art portrait artist. And one of the things she did that was very surprising to everybody is that she was using long lenses and big negatives, and so there was sort of an inherent shallow depth of field in her photos, and instead of trying to correct it, she actually made use of it. And she also used long shutter speeds. So we have a combination here of this beautiful shallow depth of field. Look how things are getting soft here. The only thing that's really tightly in focus is her eyes, and just a little bit of motion. So it makes it very romantic and kind of dreamy. Now, that's not to say that every early fine art photographer was using shallow depth of field. You have people like Carleton Watkins, who was a great influence later on Ansel Adams. And he was a Scottish-born photographer who immigrated and lived in California. And he made these beautiful, large-scale photos of the Sierras and Yosemite, with this absolute perfect depth of field. And notice how important that is to this scene, that we can see all the details in the reflection of the water, the trees, the mountains, all the way back to the far mountains out here. And it's showing all of these details in the foreground, middle ground, and background that make this photo so strong. Now, the pictorialists, who came a little bit later in the 19th century and who were sort of an outgrowth of people like Julia Margaret Cameron, they went back to this idea of the shallow depth of field. This is a photograph by Edward Weston when he was still still doing pictorialism. And you can see, again, very much like Julia Margaret Cameron, faster shutter speed, but that very beautiful sort of dreamy shallow depth of field. Now, this is, contrary to that, just a little bit later, this is Ansel Adams. And I know we've talked about Ansel Adams, and I think I've shown you this photograph before. Ansel Adams and the group of people that he was associated with, Group F64, were, contrary to a lot of previous fine art photographers, were really, really obsessed with deep depth of field. Thus, they called themselves Group F64, a very small aperture designed to give deep depth of field. In this photograph, taken in Yosemite, not only is the aperture small, but he's also using a relatively wide angle lens, which will also give you deeper depth of field. And you can tell that because the rocks in the foreground are so large compared to the mountains in the background. Another photographer who was very interested in deep depth of field was the early USSR photographer Alexander Rutchinko. He was working with a smaller camera, but he was really interested in telling stories. And oftentimes when you're telling narratives with photographs, you want to show the details of each part of the scene. And this is a metaphor about the working man climbing up the ladder, raising himself up rung by rung above us. And we can see that although it's the tiniest bit shallow here, it is very, very tightly in focus all the way up to the top of the rung. On the other hand, Gordon Parks, who was a little bit later, a very important photojournalist and also did fashion, but this was one of his most famous photojournalistic projects when he was working for the US government, documenting urban conditions in New York and Washington, D.C., particularly conditions for African Americans at that time. And this very, very famous photograph, he uses slightly shallow depth of field to emphasize the charwoman in the front and to slightly blur out the flag in the back, as if there's an irony between her condition and the flag. This is Robert Frank, uses a wide-angle lens with very, very wide open apertures. Now, remember that there are these separate factors that control depth of field. A wide-angle lens will tend to give you a deeper depth of field, but if you get up close with a wider aperture, you're going to get a shallower depth of field. This is probably somewhere in between, but the closeness really emphasizes the pattern on the backs of these men's jackets, and it gets really startlingly softer as we go out. So this is a kind of a breaking the rules photograph, where he's making you look at this thing that would normally be the not subject, and he's telling you, in this case, it is the subject, the massive size of these men's backs. Gary Winogrand, who was working around the same time as Robert Frank, very famous street photographer. He habitually used a wide-angle lens, very common for a lot of street photographers, so that again, if he's telling a narrative, he can keep everything in everything in focus, so that we see all the details of this story, of this protest in the 60s, all the way from this little girl's face here, all the way out and out into the city. So we see this context of where we are. And we can tell it's a wide-angle lens, again, because everything in the foreground is so large and drops off in size very, very rapidly. Mary Ellen Mark, who comes a little bit later, made this project Streetwise, where she photographed on the streets of Seattle. And in this photograph, she's deliberately using shallow depth of field to emphasize the child and the kitten, and to blur out the background, to really make this figure, make it into more of a portrait rather than a narrative just about the scene. Stephen Shore almost always, I'm trying to think now, there's photographers that sometimes use shallow depth of field, sometimes use deep depth of field. Gary Winogrand, for example, almost always is using deep depth of field. Mary Ellen Mark goes back and forth. Stephen Shore also, virtually everything that he makes has this very, very sharp, deep depth of field. From the foreground, you see this right on the rail of this car, the side of this car, all the way back to the rainbow, the motel sign. And he does this very deliberately. He wants to show this very factual, realistic view of the world. He wants to show everything in detail and tell this narrative that's a layering of subjects, one on top of the other, not a single subject, but multiplicity of subjects. Keith Carter, on the other hand, contemporary black and white photographer, works often with a very, very shallow depth of field, so that in this case, the subject in the background becomes almost a shadow. He's so blurred out. And it becomes more enigmatic, a story where we have to put our own narrative in. In this Paul Cappa Negro, this black and white photo taken in, I believe in the UK, he wants us to actually catch the details of everything from this amazing gnarled tree to this beautiful rock and all the way back to the livestock and the trees in the background. So again, he's creating deep depth of field, so we're looking all the way through. Rebecca Norris Webb is a photographer who habitually works either in very wide angle lens with very deep depth of field, or a longer lens and working very shallow. She does some other interesting things with her work. So in this case, it's very important for her to have this plastic debris on the fence in the foreground in tight focus, the plastic in the midground, and all the way out. And so we get this sense of it extending out into the landscape. Now, in this photograph, she does something very interesting. Her depth of field, in a sense, is very deep because the vast majority of the scene is in focus, but she's placed this one sunflower right in front of her lens, and so it falls out of focus and really sort of takes up this scene. Martin Parr almost always uses deep depth of field, although there's some exceptions that I'm going to show you one in the next one, which is similar to Rebecca Norris Webb. But of course, Martin Parr is always telling stories, and in this case, you really need to have the foreground figure and the Tower of Pisa, everything in focus. Now, this is a very oddball Martin Parr, and I suspect this might have been a happy accident, that he was shooting and this woman happened to come too close to the camera and ended up in this scene, much like the sunflower in Rebecca Norris Webb, and she's very much out of focus, but it ends up being a really interesting way to compose the scene. This is Thomas Allen. He sets up these very odd little still lifes from old paperback books in his studio, and focuses them, uses a very large camera, longer lens, and makes these very, very shallow depth of field photographs that focus your attention on just the single figure. Marilyn Minter is a really interesting contemporary photographer and artist. She makes fashion and fashion satire. That's a longer story. If you want to look her up, she's pretty amazing. And in this photograph, she's gotten very, very close to this eyelid, so that we only have just a few of the eyelashes and bits of the glitter in focus while everything else falls out. Lori Nix, I think we've looked at her before. Lori Nix makes little scenarios, little narratives, sets up these scenes, and just uses, again, a larger format camera so that it has shallower depth of field and really just focuses on the single plane of focus. Alex Soth made this portrait. Very subtle shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field doesn't have to be extreme. In this case, it just helps the figure in the foreground to pop out. The sheep have gone out of focus, but not so much that we can't tell what they are, and that is important to the scene. In this Nixon photograph, he's using very, very shallow depth of field, almost abstracted. Now let's take a look at some very deep depth of field. This is Edward Bertinsky. Almost always uses, I can't think of an Edward Bertinsky where he has not used perfect absolute depth of field. He uses wider angle lenses, but he also steps a little bit back from his subject and uses very, very small apertures. So very important that we see the details of the tires from the foreground to the background. And as on this factory line that we see the workers in the front all the way to the back of this very, very large building, all tightly in focus. And you can see what a wide angle lens this is because the figures in the foreground are so very much larger than the ones in the back. Michael Kenna, magnificent contemporary black and white photographer, does very long exposures, very small apertures, slightly at a distance from his focus. Sebastião Salgado, I think almost always has deep depth of field. He's telling narratives about workers and really wants to show you the details of every person in this photograph, whether they're right in front of the camera or in the very far background. This is Robert Polidori, who does a lot of photographs of disasters. And again, telling a story, telling a narrative, very important that we see everything from the debris, the top of the piano here, all the way back to the graffiti in the background. And Jim Goldberg, who does marvelous documentary photography. Jim Goldberg occasionally uses shallow depth of field, but he more often, again, is a narrative storyteller, and he wants you to see the context of the image as well as the subject. So everything from the debris in the foreground to the child, who is the center of this image, really the subject because she's in pink and she stands out, all the way to the background of this cityscape. This is a really amazing Candida Hofer, a really amazing architectural photographer. Architecture, traditionally, very, very deep depth of field so that we see the details of the entire interior or exterior. And I believe that is it. Okay, I hope this gives you some ideas take a look at the page for the names of the photographers I showed in this slide presentation, and also take a look at the next video where I'll show some examples of some good student work from the past depth of field assignments.